This is April. How may I help you?
Hi, April. My name is Susan Wilkerson. My husband is missing.
A nuclear physicist is shot outside his home near Boston. A retired Air Force general walks out his front door in New Mexico and vanishes, leaving behind his phone, his glasses, his watch. An aerospace engineer is hiking 30 feet behind her companion, smiles and waves to show that she's fine, and is then simply gone when he turns back around. 3 people, 3 different states, 3 completely different circumstances. But then you start counting and you get to 10 or even more. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. This is Scareful Stories. What I have for you today is a story that is genuinely still unfolding. As of this week, federal agencies are actively investigating it. And there's no clean answers yet, so I just want to be upfront about that. But what there is a pattern, or possibly a pattern, and that's the part that people can't seem to agree on. This is the Scareful story of the missing and murdered scientists. Before we get into the cases, we just need to talk a little bit about how we got here, because this story has a weird journey that tells you something about the moment we're in right now. For the last couple of years, scattered across Reddit threads, UFO forums, and fringe podcasts, people had been quietly noticing that researchers connected to U.S. nuclear and aerospace programs kept dying or disappearing. Nobody in the mainstream media was paying much attention. The consensus, to the extent that there was one, was that this was a conspiracy brain pattern matching, the kind of thing that when you go looking for connections hard enough, you'll inevitably find them. And honestly, some of that skepticism is well-founded. Critics have pointed out that over 700,000 people hold top-secret clearances in the U.S. aerospace and nuclear sectors. If you run those numbers against normal mortality rates, you'd expect to find roughly 250 homicides and suicides across that population over any given multi-year stretch, plus thousands more deaths from natural causes. From that angle, 10 cases isn't a cluster, even 11 or 12 isn't. It's just pure math. The Atlantic magazine, for what it's worth, has called this the single dumbest conspiracy theory of 2026. But the White House just launched a federal investigation into the missing and murdered scientists, which is where things get really interesting because the question has stopped being, is this some crazy internet theory, and has started being exactly what we are looking at here. The conspiracy, such as it is, started coalescing in early 2026 when a retired Air Force Major General named William Neal McCaslin walked out of his home in Albuquerque, New Mexico and didn't come back. But more on him in a moment. McCaslin's disappearance was the spark for the investigation we have now. UFO-adjacent online communities, and there are a lot of them, pay close attention to anything touching Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And those groups immediately started pulling at the threads of this story. Who else connected to classified aerospace programs had gone missing? Who else had died? And the list started getting longer. Some of the names that ended up on that list belong there, and others, well, to be honest, probably don't. Critics note that Melissa Casillas, a Los Alamos employee added to this list, was an administrative assistant, not a scientist. Jason Thomas, also added to the list, was a biologist working on drug discovery, with no apparent connection to defense research at all. Amy Eskridge, whose death in 2022 got folded into the conspiracy narrative, had a degree in art history, not physics, though she had co-founded something called the Institute for Exotic Science, which gets described differently depending on who you ask. I don't know, I might want to work for something called exotic science. I know that wasn't offered at my high school. So the list comes with a lot of loose threads, and then it also has some cases that are genuinely harder to dismiss. Let's go through the people who make up the core of the actual story because the details are what matter, and they all don't point in the same direction. Let's start at the beginning. Michael David Hicks was 59 years old and had spent nearly 25 years at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where he specialized in comets and asteroids. He died on July 30th, 2023. His cause of death was not publicly disclosed. His daughter Julia told CNN that he had been dealing with known medical issues and said there is, in her own words, no train of logic connecting her father to whatever investigators are looking for. She also said that she can't help but laugh about it, though it's getting serious, which is a fair place to be when your dad's death becomes a data point in a conspiracy theory. In July 2024, Frank Myvold died in Los Angeles. He was 61, another JPL specialist, and this one in space research. No cause of death was released and no statement was made from NASA. Then, in June 2025, Monica Reza disappeared. She also went by her birth name, Monica Jacinto. She was 60 years old. She had spent 37 years at Aerojet Rocketdyne, working in materials science, and had co-invented something called Mondelez, a nickel-based superalloy used in rocket engines that went into SpaceX and the Blue Origin programs. More recently, she had moved to JPL as director of its materials processing group. On June 22, 2025, she set out on a hike near Mount Waterman in the Angeles National Forest with two companions from her yoga group. The terrain is steep and it's technical. At some point on the trail, she and her male companion were about 30 feet apart. He turned to check on her. She smiled and waved. He turned back, and when he looked again, she was gone. Search and rescue deployed for days. They had helicopters, canines, and forensic technology. Searchers covered the rough terrain around Mount Waterman thoroughly, and they found nothing. Not a trace, no body, no equipment, and no sign of where she went. And she still hasn't been found. Now, I know, guys, there are so many stories of hikers who disappear, and I really have a feeling that in this one, if the terrain is steep and technical, odds are she fell. And either she fell and she was screaming, but as she's falling, he just didn't hear her. There's a part of me that, yeah, there's that amazing idea of, gosh, did a UFO just come down and take her? Did somebody sneak out and grab her? But odds are she fell, and they just haven't been able to find her body. And you know, it's amazing. So often people go missing, like hikers go missing, and it takes years and years or decades to find their bodies, and you realize that they're found in places that have already been searched, which then leads to the missing 411 conspiracy theories, where is something taking these people out of the forest and is a UFO taking them and then dropping their bodies back? I'm not a huge believer in UFOs, so I doubt it, but her disappearance definitely is confusing because you'd think they know where she would have fallen off the trail. You think they could have found her body. But now we're heading to New Mexico, which has its own little cluster of cases. Melissa Casillas was 53 and worked at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, though to be fair, she was an administrative assistant there and not a researcher. In June 2025, she was seen walking along a highway near a small town. She had left her belongings at home, her phone had been factory reset before she left, and she has yet to be found. A factory phone reset is a very specific detail and a little odd, but it does kind of indicate to me that she was trying to get rid of all the details on her phone, probably because she didn't want it to be found. Anthony Chavez was 78, a retired foreman who had supervised construction at Los Alamos. He disappeared in May of 2025, last seen leaving his home on foot. There have been exhaustive searches and there are no signs of foul play, but there's also no indication that he had planned to leave. A friend of his named Carl Buckland told CNN, simply, it's about time that investigators were paying attention. And then there's William Neal McCaslin. He's the one who started this whole getting the White House to look into things. McCaslin was a retired Air Force Major General. Before retiring, he commanded the Air Force Research Laboratory at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, one of the most sensitive aerospace research facilities the military operates, and it's a location with its own complicated history in UFO lore, going back to the alleged Roswell incident in 1947. He had his own brief association with an organization called To the Stars Academy, a group that promotes research into UFOs and unidentified aerial phenomena, and that detail has gotten a lot of attention. On February 27th of this year, he walked out of his home in Albuquerque on foot. He left behind his phone, he left behind his prescription glasses, his wearable devices, but he did take his wallet, his hiking boots, and a .38 caliber revolver. The FBI has gotten involved in the search, and months later, there is still no explanation for where he went or why, although I think maybe there kind of is. His wife, Susan McCaslin Wilkerson, pushed back almost immediately on the UFO-adjacent speculation. She said that her husband had only a very commonly held security clearance since his retirement more than a decade earlier. She mentioned that he'd been struggling with what she described as brain fog and physical decline, and that he'd told her more than once that he didn't want to live like that. And then she addressed the UFO theories directly. She said that she had no special knowledge of alien bodies or debris stored at Wright-Patterson. She added, no sightings of a mothership hovering above the mountains have been reported, which is a sentence I kind of appreciate. She's got a little bit of sense of humor, and honestly, it sounds like her husband took off intending not to come home. Obviously, that's me speculating that he took the gun and the hiking boots and he decided to hike up the mountain and kill himself so that he didn't have to go on living and deal with his physical ailments. And as somebody whose family has been directly impacted by suicide, I will say that I can understand the desire of the person to not have their family members find them, or maybe not even have their family members know that they committed suicide, but it is a special kind of hell to have to speculate and not have an answer. And then there are the deaths that weren't disappearances. These are the ones that were definitely violent and not accidents. Nuno Loureiro was 47 years old. He was a professor at MIT in nuclear science and engineering, and he led MIT's Plasma Science and Fusion Center. He was, by all accounts from colleagues, an exceptional scientist and a widely liked person. Someone described him as a physicist you could point to as evidence that the field produces good human beings. In December of 2025, he was murdered at his home in Brookline, Massachusetts, and the details of how it happened are genuinely very difficult, not because of a conspiracy, but because of how premeditated and deliberate his murder was. The man who killed him was a 48-year-old Portuguese national named Claudio Manuel Neves Valente. He and Nuno had studied in the same physics program in Lisbon in the late 1990s. Valente graduated at the top of his class and appeared to have a promising future. But then, things didn't go the way for him that they went for Nuno, and apparently Valente had been thinking about that ever since. 2 days before he killed Nuno, Valente walked into a building at Brown University, where he had briefly been a graduate student 2 decades earlier, and opened fire on a study group. He killed 2 students and wounded 9 others, and then he drove to Brookline. On the morning of December 15, 2025, Valente parked his rental car on a street about a half a mile from Nuno's home and spent 12 hours in the neighborhood. He wore a yellow reflective safety vest and carried a box with a barcode to look like a delivery driver. He ate at a Vietnamese restaurant and paid in cash, and police later said that he spent part of the afternoon doing what they described as pre-operational surveillance, circling the block and mapping entry and exit routes. At 8:33 p.m., the doorbell rang at Nuno's building. When Nuno stepped into the foyer to see who it was, Valente shot him. Nuno died early the next morning. Valente drove away with his lights off, checked into his storage unit in New Hampshire, and died by suicide. When investigators found him days later, he had left behind video recordings explaining that he had been planning the Brown shooting for a long time. He offered no motive, though, just that no one had ever sincerely apologized to him, which I guess was motive enough for him, but really, what in the world? But despite this murder and who it was done by, Nuno still ends up on a list of missing and dead government scientists, because that's what he is, but it seems pretty clear that his murder isn't part of a larger conspiracy. So it's a kind of a strange part of the story, because the evidence is really clear. It was a man with a grudge, nursing it for 25 years, and it really had nothing to do with classified research, at least that we know of. Carl Grillmar was 67 and an astrophysicist at Caltech who collaborated with NASA and was known for his work on detecting water on planets outside of our solar system. He was fatally shot on his front porch outside Los Angeles in February of this year. Authorities arrested a 29-year-old named Freddie Schneider and charged him with the murder, carjacking, and burglary. Investigators noted that Schneider had previously been reported for trespassing on Gromar's property in the weeks before the shooting, so this wasn't an entirely random incident. There's no indication that Snyder knew or cared anything about Gromar's research, which either makes it less alarming or just alarming but in a different way. And then there's Matthew James Sullivan. He was 39, a former U.S. Air Force intelligence officer. He was scheduled to testify in a federal whistleblower case involving UFOs. He died in 2024 before he could testify. Congressman Eric Burleson of Missouri told Fox News the death was a suicide, but he also called it suspicious, and the FBI is being asked to look into it. And then there's also Stephen Garcia, a 48-year-old government contractor who oversaw nuclear weapons assets at the Kansas City National Security Campus, which manufactures non-nuclear components for America's nuclear arsenal. He disappeared from Albuquerque in August of 2025, last seen on surveillance footage walking away from his home on foot carrying a handgun. What is up with all these people leaving their homes carrying handguns? Police initially warned he might be a danger to himself. A source close to the case pushed back on that and described him as a very stable person. Garcia and McCaslin both lived in the same part of New Mexico, and authorities have not confirmed any connection between the two men. And this might be a good time to kind of zoom out for a minute, because the list is worth scrutinizing. Jason Thomas was an associate director of chemical biology at Novartis, a pharmaceutical company. He was working on using chemistry and biology to discover new medicines, including potential cancer treatments. He disappeared in December of 2025, and his body was found in a Massachusetts lake 3 months later. Police said no foul play was suspected. And why is he linked in with the other cases? Because Novartis has some Department of Defense contracts. That's it. That's the entire thread. They're not saying Jason Thomas worked on anything having to do with the Department of Defense. I don't know what the Department of Defense would have any interest in curing cancer. It's the Department of Defense. But because the company he worked for in other areas is connected to the Department of Defense, that puts him on the list. Melissa Casillas, remember, was an administrative assistant in Los Alamos and not a researcher. And then there's Amy Eskridge, who died in 2022. She was 34. She had co-founded the Institute for Exotic Science in Huntsville, Alabama, and in podcasts recorded before her death, she claimed that she and her team were being subjected to harassment and what she called psychological warfare intended to stop her work on anti-gravity and exotic physics. I just love that, exotic physics. Authorities ruled her death a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Her family said in a statement that she was a marvelously intelligent person who suffered from chronic pain. And then they said this: people should realize that scientists die also and not make too much of it. Which, if we're looking at it, that's the whole point, right? At some point, the question stops being, are these scientists who are being targeted, and becomes, what exactly counts as a scientist for the purpose of the list or the purpose of the investigation? The honest answer seems to be, right now, that anyone with a connection, however loose, to any government-adjacent workplace falls on the list. That doesn't mean that the cases aren't worth taking seriously, though. It means that maybe we're muddying the waters. The list is probably doing more work than the evidence actually supports, and we should probably take a closer look at it, because in grouping everybody together in one big conspiracy theory, that might mean that some of those individual cases aren't treated as seriously as they should be. And as interesting as I find all the stories, these individual stories of the people, I find it really fascinating how this went from living in a niche corner of the internet to being a full-flung federal investigation. And the short version of that story is it involves Fox News, a Reddit tip, and a Peter Doocy question at a White House briefing. The cases had been circulating in UFO forums and alternative media for a while, connected primarily through the McCaslin disappearance and the UFO angle tied to Wright-Patterson. Then, in March of 2026, the New York Post ran a story suggesting a professional connection between McCaslin and Monica Reyes. Tabloids picked up that story. Fox News ran segments. Representative Tim Burchett, a Republican congressman who has been publicly pushing for more government transparency on UFOs, told the Daily Mail that he suspected McCaslin's disappearance was connected to his aerospace work. Then, on April 15th, Fox's Peter Doocy asked White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt directly whether the administration was looking into the cases, and the White House said yes. Leavitt put out a statement saying the administration was actively working with all relevant agencies and the FBI to holistically review all of the cases together. She added, "No stone will be unturned." And just like that, it wasn't a conspiracy theory anymore. It was a full-on federal investigation. The House Oversight Committee announced its own probe days later. Chairman James Comer went on Fox News and said he'd initially dismissed the whole thing as some kind of crazy conspiracy theory. Yeah, you think? But that learning more about the individual cases had changed his mind. He said publicly, "It's very unlikely that this is a coincidence." He called it a national security threat, and President Trump said he'd just come from a meeting about it, and he called it pretty serious stuff. Now, the skeptics haven't gone away, and I probably am one of those. Experts in nuclear security note that the cases are spread across different labs, different specialties, and different years. Joseph Rogers at the Center for Strategic and International Studies said that if they were all working on one specific project, he'd be more suspicious. But as it stands, the common thread is loose at best. Investigators close to the individual cases keep saying the same thing. They don't see any links between them. But those close to the individual cases also aren't necessarily looking across all of them at once, and that's now what the FBI is doing. And for what it's worth, this isn't the first time this kind of story has surfaced. In the months after 9/11, at least 11 of the world's leading microbiologists died in sudden or unexplained circumstances, all within about 5 months of each other. And before that, between 1982 and 1990, over 20 British defense scientists working on classified Cold War projects died under circumstances officially ruled as suicides and accidents. The same basic questions each time, the same basic absence of answers. Whether that history makes the current story more or less credible is something you can decide for yourself. But more on both of those soon, because I might do videos on those, especially the Cold War ones, because those are some really weird deaths. So if you want that, put a note in the comments. But here's the thing I come back to with this story. Some of these cases have explanations that don't require a big conspiracy theory. Nuno was killed by a man with a 25-year grudge, and that case was thoroughly investigated and closed. Carl Grillmar appears to have been killed by someone who didn't even know him, which is tragic, but it doesn't suggest a coordinated operation. Michael Hicks had medical issues. Anthony Chavez was 78 years old, and McCaslin's own wife pointed to his declining health. And yet, there is some weirdness around the aerospace engineer vanishing 30 feet from her companion on a busy trail in broad daylight who has never been found, and a government contractor just walking away from his home with a revolver and disappears in the exact same city as the missing general. The phone factory reset before a woman leaves her belongings and walks out onto a highway is odd, and an Air Force whistleblower dies before he can testify, which to me is the biggest one. Although that one too they said was suicide, but you can make a murder look like suicide. That's the one I'd be looking into. At this point, there's no confirmed link between any of the cases, and some of them may turn out to be exactly what they look like, individual, unrelated tragedies, but others, maybe not. Right now, that's what the investigators are trying to figure out, and until they do, this just will stay in that uncomfortable middle space where there are enough similarities to notice, but not enough answers to explain them. And that might be the strangest part of the whole thing. So that's the Scareful story of the missing and murdered scientists. Until next time, stay safe, stay careful, and maybe consider a career outside of the aerospace industry. Bye, guys.